Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 126 of ASBN Live. On behalf of the American Sustainable Business Network, I'm Tulsi Sivalingam, the Senior Manager of Events and Programming, and I'm so excited for this session today to learn about a topic that is evolving, and I'm so excited to hear what our speakers are working on. So today we're going to hear about a new toolkit that's designed to improve the human rights performance of supply chain relationships. And this is brought to us by our panelists, who are each part of the working group of the American Bar Association Business Law Section. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to them to share this toolkit with us.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. We're really honored and excited to be here. I'm Sarah Dadush. I'm a professor of law at Rutgers Law School, where I also am the founding director of our Business and Human Rights Law program.
Hi, everybody. I'm Olivia Windham Stewart. I am a senior fellow and the deputy director of the Business and Human Rights Law program at Rutgers Law School.
And hi, everyone. I'm Patrick Miller. I'm founding attorney at P. Miller Legal Services. We're an international arbitration and disputes law firm, which focuses on working with social impact businesses and other mission-aligned organizations.
So we're going to be presenting to you today the work that we've been bringing forward as members of the ABA Business Law Section Working Group that has developed a set of model contract clauses. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what are the model contract clauses and why we developed them. So we developed, as part of this working group, 33 model contract clauses that are designed to be pan-industry, so adoptable by firms operating in everything from apparel to ag to electronics, and can be introduced into your international supply contracts for goods in order to improve the human rights performance of those contracts and by extension of your supply chains. So as I said, there are 33 of them. They are pan-industry. They're also modular. So our expectation is that the model contract clauses can be edited, adapted to the needs of the adopting firm, however they see fit. And they were published, the MCCs 2.0 were published in March of last year, March of 2021. And we've been working for the last year plus to socialize firms, especially mission-driven firms, on the existence of the model contract clauses and the why of them. So the why of them is to fill two gaps. The main, one of the gaps is that most contracts and contract law generally is pretty good at dealing with issues of non-conforming goods where the goods just don't work the way that they're supposed to. So we're pretty good at identifying soccer balls that don't bounce, for example, or that don't kick properly. This is maybe not the best description of soccer ball conformity. But anyway, we're pretty good at identifying non-bouncing balls as non-conforming. We're less good at identifying perfectly stitched soccer balls and perfectly bouncy soccer balls that were stitched by child labor or by workers whose wages aren't being paid or have been stolen, or workers who are working in unsafe, unsanitary conditions as non-conforming. So the MCCs, one of the gaps that we try to fill is this, conformity is not just about the product itself, it's also about the production process. Was the thing made in accordance with the applicable human rights standards? The second gap that the MCCs seek to fill is really a practical one. We have found in our conversations with firms that many firms have human rights policies on their books. They have stated commitments to achieving ESG objectives. For us, this really goes to the S in ESG. but their contracts don't support their achievement of these stated objectives, don't support the implementation of their human rights policies. In fact, oftentimes the contracts are drafted in a way that can actually undermine the achievement of the social and/or environmental objectives that the companies may desire to pursue. And we refer to this gap, this disconnect between the policy and the contract, as a coherence gap. And the MCCs are a very practical toolkit to bridge the coherence gap and help companies to enlist their contracts as allies in achieving their ESG policies and their human rights objectives. And what we have found in terms of this still goes to the why of the MCCs is that to the extent that contracts do mention human rights, the way that firms tend to approach these contracts doesn't work. Contracting as usual doesn't work. Typically, again, to the extent that human rights are referenced in contracts, the shape that these references take is through supplier-only representations and warranties that everything is good in the supply chain. There are no human rights problems now and never will there be. We will always stay in compliance with the buyer's human rights standards. These supplier-only representations are really ineffective. And they're fictitious in the sense that no supplier can actually guarantee human rights compliance throughout the life of the contractual relationship. And it really just encourages a tick box approach to contracts and to achieving good human rights performance, where it's just like, okay, well, we get the supplier to warrant that everything is good, and then we can just forget about it. It's all on the supplier's side of the contractual balance sheet. This is ineffective for purposes both of managing human rights risk and managing business risk and managing legal risk. Another deficiency of traditional contracts is that they tend to disregard how the buyer's own purchasing practices can generate very intense pressure for the supplier that makes it actually really hard for the supplier to meet the buyer's own human rights standards. And Olivia will speak more about this in her presentation. And a last way in which contracting as usual doesn't work pertains to remedies. So contracts, typically, if there is a breach, remedies will flow from the breaching party to the non-breaching party. This doesn't work. This system doesn't work, where what you have is the people who are harmed by the breach are actually not party to the contract. And so we need to shift away from a traditional contracts approach to contract remedies toward one where remedies are actually channeling or being directed toward the victims. So in short, traditional contracts are ineffective for all these purposes: managing risks, protecting human rights, achieving good ESG performance, and carrying out effective human rights due diligence. And Patrick will also be speaking more to the question of legal risk. So moving on to Olivia.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's really, really nice to be here. Thank you for having us. So Sarah has been walking you through what contracting as usual looks like and some of the deficiencies that we find with that. And what we're proposing through the MCCs, and we'll hope to explain in a bit more detail here, is that effectiveness for managing human rights risks in supply chains through your contracts really requires a shared responsibility approach. So this is an approach that can be found enshrined in the United Nations Guiding Principles and also the OECD Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct. And what this means is that instead of requiring the supplier solely to take responsibility for the human rights performance in your supply chains, your production facilities, you're actually undertaking as a buyer shared responsibility for that. So it's not just the supplier, it's also your own role as a buyer. Now, on the left, we have a breakdown of some of the things that we see in conventional contracts, what Sarah was referring to as contracting as usual. I won't go into this in much detail because Sarah's covered some of it already, but what we're thinking about here with these traditional contracting regimes is this unilateral approach, this representations and warranties that are required of the supplier to certify that they can uphold the human rights standards single-handedly. The supplier being the only party that can cause a social breach of contract, regardless of the behavior of the buyer, and the remedies that flow from the supplier to the buyer in the event of that breach. Now, how HRDD, so that's human rights due diligence aligned contracts, and human rights due diligence is a concept found in the United Nations Guiding Principles and also expanded upon in the OECD guidance. So human rights due diligence aligned contracts move away from the representations and warranties approach and introduce a mutual obligation between the buyer and the supplier for the human rights outcomes in the supply chain. So that means that the buyer has to be much more cognizant of their own behavior and the potential impacts that might have on the production floor, in the field, wherever the goods are being produced. So through the shared responsibility regime, the MCCs also break down some of the specific responsibilities which fall into the category really of responsible purchasing practices that buyers need to undertake to ensure that they're sort of fulfilling their side of the bargain, right? So they're doing the right, they're engaging in the right behavior in the way that they also ask their suppliers to. So of course, because their business is different to that of the supplier, the responsibilities are specific to the buyer. So it can include responsible pricing, so making sure that your contract prices can cover the cost of production. It can also include providing reasonable assistance to the supplier in the event that the supplier needs help to uphold responsible business conduct. It can involve being responsible when making change orders or modifications to an order. So not simply saying, actually, I don't need these t-shirts in a month, I need them in a week. Really working with the supplier to understand if that can be managed and how. And also a very particular issue, which is responsible exit, which is making sure that in any event, whether you're leaving a site for commercial reasons or human rights reasons, you're doing so responsibly, keeping the human rights impact of that exit in mind, and doing whatever you can to mitigate that. And then finally, on the point of damages, with HRDD aligned contracts, if there is a breach of the human rights standard, what we have instead of damages, financial damages flowing from one party to another, is human rights remediation. So before all other things happen, the buyer and the supplier have to collaborate together, potentially in partnership with other buyers as well, who are engaged in business relationships on the site, to provide human rights remediation to any victims of the adverse human rights impact. And that really has to come before any other engagement in damages between the two parties. So the HRDD aligned contracts really pivot away from putting sole responsibility on the supplier and thinking about the two parties in that way, to really trying to distribute responsibility evenly between the two parties so that they can each account for their actions and think about how they can both participate in improving the human rights standards in the contracts. So with that, I will move over to Patrick. Patrick.
Hi, everyone. So now, I'll be talking about the human rights risk and particularly the legal risk. I think Sarah captured pretty well a lot of the issues with respect to human rights risk and operational and business risk. I think the audience we have here probably understands that companies have a responsibility to protect human rights abroad and to not contribute to any human rights violations through their business practices. So I think that this audience understands that. And I think there are plenty of other more traditional companies that understand the operational and business risk attached to not having proper oversight over your supply chain, such that you allow your business enterprise to contribute to human rights abuses. We've talked about losing brand value or disrupting supply chains, or even losing access to certain financial investors or financial instruments, for instance, impact investment funds. if you don't properly monitor and manage your supply chain with respect to your human rights policies. The point that we're trying to make is it's important to not only have a human rights policy, you need to have contracts that implement those human rights policies. I think over the past few years, it's become clear that the previous approach of maintaining simply a one-sided supplier code of conduct has devolved into a tick box exercise in the majority of cases. And it's devoid of substance and devoid of effect for your purposes. Even if it's supplemented by social audits and on the ground inspections, those are absolutely helpful and essential, but you need to also have a contractual framework for all those activities to take place. And that's what we've tried to allow for the MCCs to do. So that's why we argue that the MCCs are more effective, because they allow for this human rights due diligence, they allow for the continuous monitoring, they allow for enforceable obligations and tied to remediation rather than simply just contract breaches. So now I guess I'm wearing a tie, so I have to talk about the legal risk aspect of this in particular. So if you look at the different legal regimes, you're finding that governments are increasing pressure on multinationals to remove products that are tainted by human rights abuses from their streams of commerce. You see this in large part in the consumer economies, where governments are requiring that products that have these taints don't have access to their consumer economies. So probably the most sweeping and largest affecting action is the proposed directive on human rights due diligence out of the EU. Now, although it's widely sweeping, it hasn't been put into effect yet. So I don't think there's much that we can discuss about it right now, other than to say that it's rooted in the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidance and other best practices with respect to business and human rights. And it's also rooted in the same principles that were contextualized when we formulated, or when the working group formulated the MCCs. So the MCCs are a useful tool to implement those UN guiding principles into your contractual frameworks, and will likely be helpful when the EU directive comes into effect. And although the EU directive itself, the EU-wide directive on human rights due diligence isn't in effect, there are several jurisdictions, there's Germany and France and the Netherlands, that have already implemented their own human rights due diligence regimes, which are in effect right now. So companies need to be aware of those human rights due diligence regimes when they're operating in those regions. In the US, and I think we're at the American Council, so I think we can focus on the US approach. There's been a prohibition against forced labor for nearly 100 years. People don't realize that we've always had these prohibitions. It's just the approach that the government has taken to enforcing those prohibitions against forced labor and child labor and things like that. One of the ways that there have been increasing enforcement of these prohibitions is through what are called withhold release orders. These are WROs that are issued by the US government, which effectively say that certain types of products will be scrutinized upon importation. And if you're not able to provide proper documentation to prove that these goods weren't produced using forced labor, then you won't be able to import them into the country. So the WRO regime has been picking up steam over the past few years, and there have been some specific WROs with respect to the Xinjiang region. I feel so bad when I try to pronounce Chinese words. I believe it's Xinjiang region of China. Goods produced in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, particularly they focused on tomatoes and cotton under previous WRO regimes. Cotton obviously has a lot of effects in downstream in the apparel sector. Now they've passed in December 21 the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. This is the UFLPA regime. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act came into force last week and effectively says that any goods that have a nexus to the Xinjiang region or to a list of prohibited entities that the US government has found have a involvement in the actions that are taking place in China that the US government has deemed involve human rights abuses, if you have products that have a nexus to that region or to those entities, then it's presumed that your products were produced using using forced labor. So it's presumed that you're not able to import those products. This effectively creates two key questions for pretty much anybody who's importing products from Asia, particularly China, but really when you think about the Asian economic region, there's a lot of integrated supply chains within that region before they come to the North America. So if you're importing products from that part of the world, you really need to have a strong sense of how your products are made and what are the conditions under which they're being made. So you really need to answer the first question: are my products within the scope of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act? Do any of my products have a nexus to this region? So you have to have a effective supply chain mapping that maps out your supply chain from the first input, from really the time when your inputs are mined, all the way to the time that they're refined, manufactured, assembled, and all of those things. So throughout that supply chain, you need a map, and then you need to trace your specific goods shipment by shipment. And that's all just so you can tell the US government if your goods are seized, we are not within the scope of the UFLPA. Our goods don't touch this region, or they don't have any involvement with these prohibited entities. There's plenty of companies that have found it unfeasible to effectively carve out that area of China from their supply chains. And for those parties, they have a much more uphill task in having to prove through clear and convincing evidence that those goods weren't produced using forced labor. They have to rebut the presumption that they were produced using forced labor. And to do that, you need to have effective supply chain management measures and effective human rights due diligence. And as we said previously, the previous regime of one-sided supplier contracts, supplier codes of conduct, and social audits is not proven to be an effective way of managing your suppliers or understanding or elucidating the processes under which your products are being made. So if you're in a position of having to have your goods produced that are within the scope of the act, it should really behoove you to have something like MCCs in place, a contractual framework in place for you to better control, better manage your international supply chains. So that's a large part of the legal risk. And then with respect to ESG and non-financial disclosure requirements, we've discussed how the SEC is starting to release guidelines on reporting requirements with respect to your environmental performance. Surely the S provisions will be coming online soon, and we would expect that the human rights performance of your supply chain would fall under that S portfolio. And so it's important to be ahead of that requirements, and it's important to have proper documentation and proper evidence for the purpose of supporting those disclosure requirements. So that's why another reason why the MCCs are useful in that context. I think that gives you a good sense of some of the legal risks that companies are taking on with respect to this, and how the MCCs can be helpful in managing that risk. And so I'll pass it back to Sarah. Do you want to say anything?
That's it. The short story is, right, contracting as usual doesn't work. We need to move toward a regime that is more rooted in principles of shared responsibility, not only to address legal risk, as Patrick helped us understand the magnitude of the legal risk and how it's rapidly evolving, but also to improve effectiveness and ensure effectiveness of companies, especially purpose-driven or social businesses, human rights and ESG objectives. So with that, thank you so much for your attention, and we're very happy to take any questions. And I'll exit the slide.
There are a few questions already in the chat, so I've had a look at them. I can kick them off, and then if people have more I think the only way to do it is to put them in the chat, but please feel free to put them in the chat. The first one is from Amy, and it says, are these MCCs aligned with, mapped to any specific ESG social impact frameworks such as GRI or B Corp, etc.? The main international instruments the MCCs are aligned with are the United Nations Guiding Principles and the OECD guidance. So in that sense, they're moving to that regime. When we're working with organizations such as B Corp, it would be to integrate use of the MCCs into their standard as a requirement. So the contracts themselves, and we should put the link to the contracts in the chat so you can actually see what they look like, and it can kind of contextualize it a bit. The contracts themselves wouldn't contain B Corp standards because the standards are sort of separate to the contracts. If that makes sense. But if you want to put follow-up questions in the chat, please also feel free.
I'll just add to that,
yeah, sure.
One of our hopes is actually the other direction will happen, that B Lab will utilize the MCCs to develop standards for B Corps. So companies that want to be certified as B Corps, or companies that want to do well under a GRI rating system or other social impact frameworks would be asked, do you take human rights into consideration in your supply contracts? Do you have a shared responsibility approach to contracting? Do you discuss human rights remediation as a matter of priority in your contracts with international suppliers? These kinds of questions we are trying to get out into the world, the B Labs, the et ceteras, to inform the ratings, to inform the ratings, the rankings, the eligibility for B Corp status. So thank you so much for that question, Amy. It's sort of the flip movement is what we're after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Amy. And again, if anyone wants to kind of follow up with us separately, we'd be more than happy to have one-to-one conversations another time. There's another one from R. Dennis Olson, which, to paraphrase, essentially says, to what degree does this initiative explicitly support the enforcement of the human rights of workers to organize a union? I'll just explain what the toolkit is. So the toolkit has 3 components, and the first, the kind of central one that we've been talking about the most, are the contractual clauses, and those are human rights due diligence aligned contractual clauses, and those are about how you engage with your supplier, the level and degree of responsibility you take on as a buyer, and what that relationship should look like. In addition to that, we have guidance on Schedule P, and that's about creating the policy and the human rights standards that are applicable to your company. So that is where you would put the ILO conventions, the ILO fundamentals, other ILO conventions, any other things you might want to put in, specific information about migrant workers, female workers, anything you like. As individuals, we would encourage you to include freedom of association conventions. The MCCs do not dictate standards. Right. The MCCs provide a process by which you can uphold those standards in a more realistic way. So there's a slight distinction. Now, the third thing in the toolkit is Schedule Q, which is the buyer code, which is meant to be the sort of counterweight to the traditional supplier code. And it's really about the standards and the behaviors that are expected of the buying firm. And that runs, it's quite a long document. It's a kind of framework document for buyers to use. And it runs through institutional commitments to negotiating a contract, performing a contract, addressing remediation, exiting a contract. So those are the 3 things. So the union stuff you'd find in the policies. The MCCs themselves are about how the buyer and the supplier behave and allocate responsibility between them to uphold those standards. Anything to add, Patrick or Sarah?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, cool. And then the third one is, would these contracts address third-party involvement, e.g. transport, as well as the production of products themselves? Sarah, do you want to answer?
Well, sure. I'll give it a shot. So the two ways that I can address the question. One is the the first clause in the MCCs is a joint commitment undertaking by both buyer and supplier to carry out ongoing human rights due diligence throughout the life of their contract, and in a cascading way that goes, to the suppliers, the sub-suppliers, etc. And so in that carrying out of human rights due diligence, you're looking at adverse impacts, or the adverse impacts meaning potential and actual adverse impacts anywhere in the supply chain. So absolutely, that could capture adverse impact for third parties, like folks working in shipping or transport, and as well as you say, as the folks involved in the production of the goods themselves. And another way to address the question is to say that a lot of people ask us, well, how are the workers involved in determining whether the buyer and the supplier are meeting up to their human rights commitments as stated in the contract and in the policy schedule? And our answer to that is, again, human rights due diligence requires, ongoing engagement with stakeholders, including workers, of course. As well, we have a whole section of the MCCs dedicated to human rights remediation, which also requires ongoing engagement with the victims, and to ensure that they are satisfied both with the remediation plan and that they certify when the remediation plan has been fully implemented. So there is that. Separately, as I mentioned, the clauses are modular. One of the ways that you can draft the MCCs is to say no third parties will be allowed to bring claims under the contract. That's what's called a no third party beneficiary clause. But another way that you could draft it, and we have that variation in there too, is to say anybody can bring claims under against the parties under the contract. Any contract stakeholder, workers, your folks involved in the transport, like third parties that are distant or closely removed from the contract itself. So that I hope that answers your other excellent question, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so there are some slightly broader questions now, which we may all have different answers to.
So I'll take a stab at a little bit of it, because I was having a conversation yesterday. They're quite
about
broad.
Which one? About how we changed which one? This Apple one or the how we changed the system one?
I guess I have to talk about the Apple one since I talked about WROs, but I think the short answer to the Apple one is, to the extent that Apple's importing products, I don't think the CBP and the enforcement agencies will distinguish between a shipment containing iPhones and a shipment containing any other good, would be the short answer with respect to that. So, and then just with respect to the larger question, there's plenty of different answers to that question. One item that people are focusing on now, rather than prohibiting human rights abuses outright, there's been a big push for human rights due diligence, which is just at least assessing and analyzing your supply chain and uncovering abuses, so that way there isn't a purposeful system of ignorance. So that will go a long way. At least getting coverage of everyone's supply chain will be very important. So that's one item that national governments have been highlighting, which is less ambitious than prohibiting products outright, but still something that's effective. Another item is you can't just have the companies taking voluntary steps. You need pressure from national governments. You also need pressure from the investor class. I was having a conversation with an ESG specialist at a mining company yesterday, and she said it would be a different story if our investors told us we have to have these MCCs in order to maintain our working capital requirements, our investment requirements. So really the question is, you need to have pressure from a number of different groups on the companies to do these matters. It's not something that the companies can even realistically take on a voluntary basis in a lot of cases. So that's another way that things are changing.
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
just one other point that I always love talking about is we have a framework for this. We have contaminated products from the 20th century that we were able to remove from the supply chain. We were able to remove lead from paint and all these things. What happens is you have the government or whatever regulatory body prescribes a rule saying these aren't allowed, and then you have private actors who within their contractual relationships enforce those so that they ensure that their goods will be able to enter the stream of commerce. So you have the enforcement body at the top, but then enforcement through the supply chain vis-a-vis contractual arrangements between the commercial parties. So that's what I'd say.
Cool. Thanks, Patrick. Sarah, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, that was so helpful, Patrick. I just wanted to add that as far as the fast forest, because I take that point. Contracts are really fast. You don't have to wait for legislation to change and upgrade your contracts, and that's particularly relevant for social businesses or businesses that take their social commitment seriously, which I gather is very true of this group. Contracts are within your dominion. It's within your discretion. You can do what you want with them, make them more fair, make them less fair. It is a lot within your discretion. And so they're quite a fast way to make change, and they have real impact. And they're, you can think of them as like the legal chains in the legal links in the supply chain. So if you make those links stronger, you make your supply chain stronger. And other aspects of things that build on what Patrick was saying as far as where else we can help is to equip suppliers with tools to negotiate for fairer contracts, and to, as Patrick said, equip investors and other groups that have leverage with the tools to exercise that leverage, particularly, for our purposes with respect to contracts.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. I mean, other than to say we're going to need change in all directions. All of international exchange of goods is managed through contracts, the whole ecosystem. There are very few other laws. There's very little legislation. So this is just one thing that can be done. But obviously, we don't all need to work on it. There are lots of other things that other people need to be doing as well. But this is the contribution that can be made on contracts. And we would like to see it become a norm shift, not just kind of a few contracts change, but the entire way of contracting to change for the production of all goods and all international supply chains wholesale. That's really what we're aiming for with this. So another question: how does your program implement enough supply chain transparency to be effective? Within the MC, do you want to get?
No,
I was just going to say, within the MCCs, we require communication and transparency and cascading through the supply chain. Another thing to just kind of contextualize the project a bit is we published these last year in spring, so they're about a year old. We've spent the last year socializing them, doing webinars like this, making sure that people are aware. We're beginning to do our implementation work. So, and we're about to kind of spin off into a dedicated little organization that can do this work. So we're still at this fairly nascent stages. But as we do work with businesses to implement these, we will be looking at these specific issues like, does it improve transparency? Does it improve collaboration? Does it improve communication through these agreements? Anything to add?
Just that, on the transparency, two thoughts. One is, your contracts can be drafted, and the MCCs are drafted in such a way, but it could go even further as to elicit a lot of information from your suppliers and your supply chain generally, right? You can introduce informational requirements And then you can take that information and it can help you with the ESG reporting or social impact reporting. So there is like a real informational boon to upgrading your contracts as the MCCs would suggest. And just one other thought on the transparency, and Olivia, you can probably speak to this better, but we have gotten different transparency initiatives like the Fashion Transparency Index and Know the Chain to ask more questions of the companies that they're ranking, rating, etc., around contracts. And so there is like an increasing interest in getting some insight into what companies' contracts say as part of their social and environmental like performance assessment by outside.
That's a very good point. Yeah, that's quite important because traditionally contracts have been like heavily, deeply confidential and not discussed and shrouded in sort of mystery. But there was also a time when disclosing your suppliers was like that, and saying anything about your supply chain was like that. And we really want that to change. We would like to see more transparency about contracts. We would like companies to disclose more about how they manage their contracts, what's in their contracts, investors to ask more questions about contracts, companies to be rated on their contracts. So we're trying to open up that world so that it is much more transparent, and that so people can ask questions and really understand what's going on in a company's like legal life. Patrick, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you guys covered it pretty well. I'm just wondering.
Okay, cool.
See, there's another.
Yeah, so there's another one.
Yeah.
I mean, Forest, yeah, investors, that they do have a priority to get a return on their investment. Would Sarah, Patrick, would you like to say anything about that in particular?
I mean, yes, it's true, but
Yeah.
but there are also more and more investors that actually care about where their money is going, and this notion that we're seeing a lot coming out of the EU. So the EU is putting is as usual ahead of us in terms of developing a non-financial disclosure regulation. And they have this notion of double materiality, which is kind of like, how for corporations we think about the single bottom line versus the double or the triple bottom line. They're doing the same thing around materiality of information. So information is material insofar as it is financial. It gives you information about the financial position of the firm, but it's also material in that it gives you information about the social and environmental impact of the firm that you're investing in. And so there is this double materiality framework that is being developed for investors, suggesting that both government and there's more and more interest among investors in having their money go into entities that are doing not terrible things.
To move on, because we don't have masses of time left, it's been asked, are there any government bodies you'll be working with to standardize these contracts? We are looking and have been collaborating with some national agencies who are looking at public procurement and guidance for public procurement, and how they can use the MCCs and also the biocode to govern some of that and improve those standards. And we're also, like many people, trying to influence and make recommendations on the EU legislation, because contracts will continue to exist in supply chains. There are going to be contracts. Contractual clauses and model contractual clauses are mentioned in the EU guidance, in the EU proposal, the draft proposal that came out a couple of months ago. And we would, of course, like to see that guidance on model contract clauses aligned with our own guidance, which is aligned with due diligence, which is the nature of the proposal. So we're doing some work to try and also engage with that legislative arena, as well as the individual businesses and the kind of private actors that we can move with perhaps a bit more quickly.
And we'd really invite, if folks on this call or watching this recording at a later date, If you're interested in having a sort of walkthrough of the MCCs and thinking about how to integrate at least this notion of shared responsibility into your supply contracts, we are all available to talk with you about this. That's like literally what we're doing at the moment. It's like our focus is to change how contracts are approached and how contracting is approached. And this audience is particularly, we hope, a group of natural allies in this endeavor. Yeah, sorry, I just am seeing Amy's thing about public benefit corporations also offer legal protections when double materiality is prioritized in corporate decision making. So absolutely, the double materiality notion is right at the heart of like the B Corps and the benefit corporations and social impact investing and all this. How it's being used in the European context is really around investments and a particular kind of disclosure that it's taking that same framework that we apply to the corporations and bringing it into the investment disclosure realm.
Thanks. Patrick, there's a question for you in the Q&A.
Yeah, about human rights due diligence. So the EU regimes have a threshold for revenue. So they target the higher performing companies. So is it 500 million in revenue? So it's larger.
It's 100 million and 40 for high risk.
Yeah, so it's large. So they're targeting larger companies first that have the wherewithal to do these exercises, to be sure, and have the leverage on their supply chain to actually implement changes, because that's obviously something that you have to think about as well. There are a lot of companies that are merely buyers of things. They don't have their products manufactured on a bespoke basis for them, so they don't have as much leverage.
But also the way, the sort of model for human rights due diligence is that you scope out your risks and identify the most high priority risks, and you address those first. So it doesn't say, because it's unrealistic and would be unhelpful, you need to address every single human rights risk in your entire supply chain all the time so that it's 100% perfect, because that's not attainable. What you have to do is really scope out where you're sourcing from, who your business relationships are, who their business relationships are with, and then where you're connected to high priority risk areas. And then you should address and mitigate risks in those areas first, and then hopefully sort of move in addressing the highest risk first, and then get down to the kind of more day-to-day risks that we might see in lower risk areas. So that's the kind of the approach that's encouraged.
And supply chain professionals are doing this with respect to political risk, with respect to, potential supply chain risks. So the zero COVID policy has implications on stopping supply chains. So more professionals are trying to map out their supply chains and get clear and clear information on those to manage risks with respect to disruptions. This is just another risk that they need to manage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any more questions? Dennis Olsen, we would love to talk to you. And Mark Lawrenson, we would think that's exactly, and also especially, to your question about what role unions play, we do actually especially want to talk to unions about how they can, bring MCCs into the mainstream and really ask companies to do this work, because we do think that it shifts power and responsibility quite significantly. So this is our contact information. So please feel free to get in touch with us, or you can also share your information, your emails in the chat, and I'll take a note of it, and then we can reach out to you. But we'd be very happy. We're dedicated to mainstreaming the MCCs, so we're always around to talk contracts.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any more questions. I just want to give a big thank you to Olivia, to Sarah, to Patrick for being here today and sharing this information, which based on the chat seems to have been very useful for all of you, which is our pleasure. Feel free to get in touch with them here. And if you want to watch this webinar later, further up in the chat, I've put the link to where the recording will be posted. So just keep an eye on that link later today or tomorrow, and you can find a recording that you can watch again, and please share with anyone who you also think would find this useful. So thank you again, and everyone have a great, wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. And Dennis, we
you.
have your email address and we'll email you, and there's Sarah's. If Tulasi, if you can just give a second for people to copy the information if they need it. I'm also just extracting a little bit from the chat. That would be great.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We hope to talk to you more.
Sure. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.